Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirala Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Alef, Parshas by Sicha Alef, and the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha, we learn about the Isser of doing Malacha on Chag Pesach, which also relates to other Yomim Tevim, and we also learn about the Heter of doing Malachas that are Tzarech Eichel Nefesh on Yom Tov. And there are 5 parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number 1, explain the difference between the way this is taught by Chag Pesach and the way it is taught by the other Yamim Tevim, this both Isser of doing Malachas and the Heter of doing Malachas that are Tzerech Eichel Nefesh. Number 2, present 2 ways of understanding the Heter by Malachas Eichel Nefesh. Number 3, based on this, ask a question on the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe. Number 4, explain an argument between Rashi and Tosfos, and based on the explanation of the argument, answer our question on the Alter Rebbe. And number 5, present the Hira in Avodas Hashem. It's written in our Parsha in connection to Chag Pesach, Uvayim Harishin Mikra Kodesh, Uvayim Hashvi Mikra Kodesh Yelachem. So both the first day and the 7th day of Pesach are Mikra Kodesh, they are Yom Tov. Kol Malacha Le'yeh Asavahem. You may not do any malacha on these days. Ach, asher ye'achal l'chol nefesh, hu levada ye'aseh lachem. Except for what is eaten by people for making food, that alone you're allowed to do. Those malachas a person is allowed to do. Meaning that the pasuk over here is telling us that it's also to do malacha on Yom Tov, just like it's also to do malacha on Shabbos, except for malachas that are l'tzarech eichel nefesh. That those malachas are permitted, those malachas are mutter. And there's a difficulty here, because the Isser of doing Malacha is written in the Torah by each Yom Tov. The Torah teaches it to us in Parshas Emer and in Parshas Pinchas. And by each of them, by the other Yomim Tevim, it says, Kol Melechas Aveda Lo Yisasu. So there's a difference between what the Torah tells us by the Yom Tov of Pesach and what the Torah tells us by the other Yomim Tevim. By the Yom Tov of the Pesach, the Torah speaks about Kol Malacha. Plainly, Kol Malacha Lo Yisasu. And by the other Yomim Tevim, the Torah says, Kol Malechas Aveda Lo Yisasu. And another difference is that the psukim by the other Yomim Tevim don't specify the heter of doing malachas that are l'tzarech eichel nefesh, which the Torah does teach us by the Yom Tov of Pesach. So we have 2 differences between what the Torah teaches us by the Yom Tov of Pesach and what the Torah teaches us by the other Yomim Tevim. By the Yom Tov of Pesach, the Torah says, Kol Melacha, plainly, without saying Melechas Avoda. And number 2, it tells us of the heter of doing Melechas that are L'tzarech Eichel Nefesh. And by the other Yomim Tevim, the Torah speaks about and teaches us that Kol Melechas Avoda Lo Yisasu, and it doesn't teach us about the heter of doing Melechas that are L'tzarech Eichel Nefesh. And so we have to understand the reason for these changes between what the Torah teaches us by the Yom Tov of Pesach and what the Torah teaches us by the other Yomim Tevim. Now, in answer to this question, the Ramban explains that Melechas Avoda refers to all Melechas that are not L'tzarech Eichel Nefesh. And Melechas that are L'tzarech Eichel Nefesh are called Melechas Hana and not Melechas Avoda. So that really essentially already answers our question. Because since by the Yom Tov of Pesach, the Torah says Kol Melacha, without saying Melechas Avoda, so it needs to then say the heter of Melechas Eichel Nefesh, because it's included in the Isser. And since it's really mutter on Yom Tov to do Melechas Eichel Nefesh, so the Torah has to specify the heter. However, by other Yomim Tovim, it just says Kol Melechas Avoda Lo Yisasu, and so that's only referring to Melechas that are not Melechas Eichel Nefesh. Because Melechas Eichel Nefesh are not Melechas Avoda, they're Melechas Hana. And he says we can see this in the Torah, like we just pointed out, that by Chag Pesach, where it first says Kol Malacha Le'yeh Asavahem, so that it then has to state, since it says Kol Malacha, meaning all Malachas, both Melechas Avoda and Melechas Hana. So the Torah has to tell us then, Ach asher ye'achel l'chol nefesh hu levada ye'aseh lachem. However, by the other Yamim Tovim, it just writes in short, Kol Malachas Aveda Lo Sa'asu, Ta'asa those Malachas that are not Eichel Nefesh. It's only Malachas Aveda. And so there's no need to specify the heter of Malachas that are L'tzorech Eichel Nefesh because they're not included in Kol Malachas Aveda. And so it comes out, according to this, that the Ramban holds that the Torah only made Malachas Aveda to be Asar and Yom Tov, but Malachas Eichel Nefesh were never included in the Isser. And that's why the Torah says Malachas Aveda by all the Yomim Tevim to teach us that only Malachas Aveda and not Malachas Hana, not Malachas that are Tzorech Eichel Nefesh are Asar. The Malachas of the Tzorech Eichel Nefesh were never Asar in the first place. Now we're going to move on to a side-related discussion about how to understand the heter of doing malachas that are l'tzorech eichel nefesh on Yom Tov. We just presented how the Ramban learns it. I'm going to move in to discuss this further. But just to point out a couple of things. Number one, at the end of the Sicha, we're going to come back to this point that we just discussed about how to understand the pasuk over here in our parsha about the Isra of doing Kol Malacha and then the Heter of doing Malachas Eichel Nefesh. And also another thing to point out is how this discussion regarding how to understand the Heter of doing Malachas Eichel Nefesh on Yom Tov is going to lead into a question on a teaching of the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch. So regarding the Heter of doing Malachas that are L'tzorech Eichel Nefesh on Yom Tov, it can be explained in two ways. The first way is that also Malachas Eichel Nefesh on their own are Asr, because they are included in what the Torah says, Kol Malacha Leya Asavahem. The Torah says Kol Malacha means every Malacha, including Malacha that is L'tzorech Eichel Nefesh. However, when they are done L'tzorech Eichel Nefesh, so when they're done for Eichel Nefesh, when these Malachas are done for the purpose of Eichel Nefesh, so then the Torah removed them from the category of Kol Malacha. And so what this means essentially is that Tzorech Eichel Nefesh is a reason, it's a tam, to be mater these Malachas. So that's one way of understanding it. So they're included, but if a person does these Malachas, L'tzorech Eichel Nefesh, so then the Torah is mater these Malachas. Another way of understanding is, and this is what it seems is what the Ramban says, that l'chatchila the malachas that are l'tzorech eichel nefesh aren't included in the Isser malacha. And when it says in the Torah, ach asher ye'achal l'chol nefesh hu levad yiyas alechem, which sounds like it's giving us a heter, it's actually, the way we understand it is that it comes to teach that the rule of kol malacha lo yasavahem doesn't refer to malachas eichel nefesh. It's not saying all malachas are aser and then telling us that these malachas become mutter, but rather it's explaining to us that when it says kol malacha, it's not referring to malachas eichel nefesh. And so this means that when it's tzorech eichel nefesh, that is a siman, an indicator of which malachas aren't included in the isser. So the difference is, do we say that it's a tam, it's a reason to make something which is aser to be mutter because it's being used l'tzorech eichel nefesh, or do we say no, it's a siman, it's an indicator of which malachas were never included in the isser in the first place. The malachas that are l'tzorech eichel nefesh are a siman that these are malachas that were never included in the isser. And the nafkamina and halacha between these two svaras, these two explanations, is whether a person who is fasting on Yom Tov may do malachas eichel nefesh, according to the svara, according to the explanation, that these malachas are mutter because of the tam, the reason that they are tzorech eichel nefesh. So it's understood that this heter is only by someone who's eating on Yom Tov, but someone who is fasting on Yom Tov. So since this person doesn't have tzorech achila with these malachas, so the issa remains on these malachas for this person. Whereas according to the svara, according to the explanation, that these malachas were never aser, the malachas of eichel nefesh were never aser on Yom Tov, so even someone who is fasting is allowed to do these malachas. continuing with this idea, it seems that we can say that this is what Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue about in Maseches Beya. It says over there in the Mishnah, Beis Shammai Eimrim Ein Metzin Leis Hakatan Chulu L'Rishus Harabim. Beis Shammai says that a person is not allowed to carry a child and other things into the Rishus Harabim on Yom Tov. Ubeis Hillel Matirin, and Beis Hillel permit it. They permit carrying a child and those other items into the Rishus Harabim on Yom Tov. And the Gemara explains that they argue whether we say Mitoich Shehutra L'Tzorech, do we say Hutra Nami Shalei L'Tzorech? Do we say that since these malachas, like carrying on Yom Tov, are permitted when they're L'Tzorech Eichel Nefesh, do we say that therefore they're also permitted when they're not being done L'Tzorech Eichel Nefesh, like by carrying a child into the Rishus Harabim, where it's not L'Tzorech Eichel Nefesh? Now simply we can say, and we have Beis Hillel over here on the right, even though it's first, because it lines up with what we have on the right side in the previous boxes. So simply we could say that Beis Hillel, the way to explain the argument is that Beis Hillel hold that when the Torah says Ach Asher Yecha L'Chol Nefesh, so with saying that, the Torah is saying that Meikara, from the very start, L'Chatchila, these malachas, Eichel Nefesh, are removed from the whole Isser of doing malacha. And therefore, since they're entirely not included in the Isser, so they're permitted even when they're not L'Tzorech Eichel Nefesh. And Beis Shammai hold that when it says Asher Yecha L'Chol Nefesh, when it says in the pasuk Ach Asher Yecha L'Chol Nefesh, it's a reason to be matter these malachas. And so automatically, therefore, the Torah did not permit them except when they're actually being done L'Tzorech Eichel Nefesh. And when they're not L'Tzorech Eichel Nefesh, so then they remain asur, they remain forbidden. Now we're going to move on to another discussion about a teaching of the Alter Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch. And based on our previous explanation, we're going to see that there's a difficulty in understanding this teaching of the Alter Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe writes in the Shulchan Aruch, Rishon Shvi Shel Pesach v'Chag HaShavuos Chulu, the Yomim Tevim, Hein Anikroim Yomim Tevim. These days are all called Yomim Tevim. V'Chol Ha'isa Melechas Aveda Ba'achas Mehen. And anyone who does Melechas Aveda in one of these Yomim Tevim, Hari is a Leikim Menatera, the person gets Malkus Menatera. Shenemar, for it says in the pasuk, Call Melechas Aveda Loi Sasu Gamer. Person's not allowed to do Melechas Aveda on these days. Then the Alter Rebbe continues, Umau Melechas Aveda. What is the definition of Melechas Aveda? Kol Melacha she'eina nasis ba'ichel oy mashka chulu. Any Melacha that's not done with food or drink. Then the Alter Rebbe continues further, Aval Kol Melacha nasis ba'ichel oy mashka. However, any Melacha done with food or drink, so Nekroy Melachas Elu Melechas Eichel Nefesh. These Melachas are called Melechas Eichel Nefesh. Sha'atera hitira la seisa, that the Torah permitted a person to do this Melacha, L'tzerech Achilas Yom Tov, for the purpose of Achilas Yom Tov, Shenemar, because it says in the pasuk, and this is the pasuk in our parsha, Ach Asher Yachol L'Chol Nefesh Hu Levadei Yaseh Lechem, that Melachas that are done L'tzerech Eichel Nefesh, those Melachas are allowed to be done on Yom Tov. And we have a difficulty over here because, and we see we lined up over here again on the right side, the explanation that it's mutter mi'ikara, and on the left side that it's only mutter when the reason is there. Because from what the Alter Rebbe writes, Uma Melechas Aveda, Kol Melacha she'eina nasis ba'ichol mashke, so it seems like the Ramban, that Melechas Aveda means Melachas that aren't L'tzorech Eichel Nefesh, and therefore, since the Torah only says Melechas Aveda, so Melechas Eichel Nefesh are mutter mi'ikara. However, from what the Alter Rebbe writes later, Shatera hitira la seisa l'tzerech achilas yom tov, so that implies that also these malachas are included in the malachas that are asur, and it's only that the Torah was matter them when they are being done l'tzerech eichel nefesh. Because the Torah hitira la seisa l'tzerech achilas yom tov, it implies that they are essentially asur, but when they're being done l'tzerech achilas yom tov, then they're mutter. So the first part of the Alter Rebbe seems to imply that these malachas are mutter mi'ikara, and the second part seems to imply that they are essentially asur, and only when they're being done l'tzarech eichel nefesh are they mutter. And so it seems to bring together both of these svaras that are different and opposite from one another. In order to answer this question on the Alter Rebbe, we're going to go into a side discussion, and it refers back to something that we already touched upon, and that is regarding the opinion of Beis Hillel that mitoich shehutra l'tzerich, so hutra nami shalei l'tzerich. So there's an argument between Rashi and Tosfos about how to understand the opinion of Beis Hillel. Rashi says that it's mutter even if there's no tzerich at all, meaning that minatayra the malacha is completely mutter, even if there's no tzerich, and only midrabanan they require that there should be a tzerich ktsas. So the way Rashi learns it is mitech shehutra l'tzerich, so hutra nami shalei l'tzerich, even when there's no tzerich whatsoever, and it's just that the rabbanim require that there should be a tzerich ktsas. However, Tosfos holds, in the opinion of Beis Hillel, that the heter of shalei l'tzerich is only when it's shalei l'tzerich oichel nefesh, but it does need to have tzerich ktsas. The way Tosfos learns it is that mitech shehutra l'tzerich, and you have to add on oichel nefesh, so hutra nami shalei l'tzerich, and you have to add on oichel nefesh. But it has to have some tzerich. It could be not the tzerich of eichel nefesh, but there must be some tzerich. And so it comes out, according to Tosfos, that also minatera, the malacha that's being done, the tzerich eichel nefesh, it isn't completely mutter. And it's only going to be mutter if it's the tzerich eichel nefesh, or even if it's for another tzerich, a tzerich ktsas. But there has to be a tzerich. And so what that essentially is saying is that the malacha isn't completely mutter. And there's a difficulty over here. According to what we explained earlier, that Beis Hillel hold that melachas eichel nefesh were melachatchila meikara, not included in the Isser, so the opinion of Rashi is very well understood. Since they were lechatchila meikara, not included in the Isser, so therefore they are mutter even if there's no tzerich whatsoever, no tzerich at all. However, according to Tosfos, we need to understand, if melachas eichel nefesh were melachatchila not included in the Isser, so then they should be mutter even without any tzerich at all. So why does Tosfos say that they have to have a tzerich ktsas? How do we understand that? And just to point out, we clearly see that Tosfos holds of this understanding, that it would seem that they're melchatchila and meikara not included in the Isser, because if they are in the Isser and you need tzerich eichel nefesh to be mutter, then they would only be mutter with tzerich eichel nefesh. Tzerich ktsas wouldn't be enough. So if Tosfos does hold of this idea, so then they should be mutter even without any tzerich at all. So in order to answer the question, we're going to go back to what we explained and learned earlier. We explained earlier in the name of the Ramban that melachas eichel nefesh are melachas hana and not melachas aveda. And so they aren't included in the Isser of kol melachas aveda leisasu. And in how to understand this, there are two ways. There's Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi says this means that malachas eichel nefesh are be'etzem a separate category. They're a separate category of malachas. That they're very mohus are malachas hana. These malachas are malachas hana. They're defined differently than the other malachas. Meaning that they don't need the intent of the person to change them into malachas hana. That's just what they are on their own, regardless of why the person is doing them. And therefore, there's no difference why a person does them, and they don't need any tzerich hayim at all in order to get the definition of being melechas hana. They are melechas hana be'etzem on their own, regardless of why the person is doing them. The way Tosfos learns this is that also melachas eichel nefesh aren't different in their mohus from the other malachas. They're not in their mohus be'etzem a different category, but rather if they are done for the hana of the person on Yom Tov, it makes no difference which hana, whether it's l'tzarech eichel nefesh or something else. So then they aren't included in melechas avoda, meaning the intent of the person is what makes them to be a different category. If they're being done for a tzarech, so then they have a different mohus, a different gather. However, if they aren't l'tzarech hayom, then they are defined as melechas avoda, which are aser on Yom Tov. And so it comes out according to this that we understand why Tosfos says you need tzarech hayom k'tzas, and also Tosfos agrees that it's a siman. These malachas are not included in what the Torah says kol malachas avoda, because when they're being done for a purpose, for a tzarech, then they are defined and categorized as Melechas Hana, which are not included in the Isser of Melechas Aveda. To explain this idea in a different signon, Rashi holds that when the Torah says Ach asher yecha l'chol nefesh, hu levade yesa lechem, so it's saying that the Torah defined these malachas as a separate category, mitzad atzmam v'guf pulasan. On their own, they are a different category. Those malachas that are done l'tzorech eichel nefesh, they're a different category of malachas, and therefore it makes no difference why the person is doing them. However, Tesos learns that with the Torah saying Ach asher yecha l'chol nefesh hu levade yesa lechem, so with that the Torah defined these malachas according to the purpose and intent of doing them. Why is the person doing them? That's what will make them into a different category. That when doing them, l'tzorech hana sa'adam, they are then malachas hana, and are melchatchila not included in malachas aveda. And so, also according to Tesos, these malachas are a siman for which malachas are not included in malachas aveda. Just according to Rashi, they're not included just because of what they are on their own, despite and regardless and irrelevant of why the person is doing them. However, according to Tesos, it's that when the person is doing them for tzorech, then they become a different category of malacha, of the malachas of Melechas Hana, and they're not included in what the Torah says, Melechas Aveda. And so it comes out that both Rashi and Tosfos agree in Beis Hillel that it's a siman for which malachas are not included in Melechas Aveda. Now we're going to move on to present another answer for understanding the opinion of Tosfos. Before we move into the answer, we're just going to point out that until now, we mentioned two possible ways of understanding the heter of doing melechas eichel nefesh on Yom Tov. One is that it's a tam, it's a reason for these melachas to be mutter, and one is that it's a siman. And within siman itself, we presented that there's two possibilities of two ways of understanding it. Either these melachas are be'etzem, such melachas that are defined as melechas hana and therefore not included in the Isser, or through the kavanah of the person, they become melechas hana, which are not included in the Isser. Now we're going to introduce within Tam itself two ways of looking at it as well. And we're going to say that Beis Hillel, who until now we thought certainly fits with Siman, according to Tosfos, we're going to say that he holds that Beis Hillel says that it fits with Tam, and we're going to explain within Tam itself another way of learning it so that it fits with the opinion of Beis Hillel that Melechas Eichel Nefesh is mutter even when there's no tzerich of actual Eichel Nefesh, even if it's a different tzerich of a person, even though it's a tam, which would seem to be that it has to be the tam of Eichel Nefesh, not a different tzerich. So, however, we can explain the opinion of Tosfos that also Beis Hillel hold that Eichel Nefesh is a tam to be matter these malachas that are osam tzad atzmam. And it's just that Beis Hillel hold that in the manner of their heter, the way the Torah makes them mutter, it's not that because it's letzarech eichel nefesh, so the isser is nitche by these malachas. Meaning, what does hutcha mean? What does nitche mean? That the importance of this tzarech is doicha the isser of doing malacha and yom tov, which then they would only be mutter if it's actual tzarech eichel nefesh, not a different tzarech of the person, because the isser is in place. It's just that the importance of this tzarech is doicha the isser, so it's only doicha it when it has the actual tzarech that is so important, which is the tzarech eichel nefesh. So he's not going to learn it that way, that it's hutcha, but rather because of the tzarech, these malachas were made entirely mutter. It's hutra, and therefore a person doesn't have to be exacting and precise that everything should be needed for eating on that day, because the whole malacha is hutra. So even if the person is preparing a large amount and only eating part of it, it's fine. And so too a person may shecht an animal, even if they only need a kazayas. Because since there is a tzarech of eichel nefesh, so it's entirely mutter, even if a majority of it isn't for this tzarech. Because once there is a tzarech of eichel nefesh, it becomes mutter. And if it becomes mutter, then it's entirely mutter, and it doesn't matter that a person is only using a small amount of it. And with this, we can explain the opinion of Beis Hillel that the Torah was matter these malachas also for other tzarchei hana, not even tzarchei, not only tzarchei eichel nefesh, other tzarchei hana as well. Because even when doing these malachas for other tzarchei hana sa'adam, and not l'tzarech eichel nefesh, they still have something in common with malachas of tzarech eichel nefesh, and that they are all tzarech ha'adam. There's tzarech ha'adam in general, and within that there's a more prominent tzarech of tzarech eichel nefesh, and there are other tzarech hana sa'adam. And so tzarech hana sa'adam have something in common with tzarech eichel nefesh, and therefore they are considered like miktsas in the context of tzarech eichel nefesh, meaning there's two types of miktsas. There is tzarech eichel nefesh, and within that a person only needs part of what they're preparing, not the whole thing, and that's mutter. And then there is qualitatively, but in eichos it's miktsas. It's miktsas of eichel nefesh because it's not really that level of importance of eichel nefesh, but it has miktsas and quality of it that it's tzarech of hanasa adam. And since we see that the malachas of tzarech eichel nefesh were made mutter even if only ktsas is l'tzarech eichel nefesh, so too the tzarech of other anas are enough, since they are like miktsas in quality and eichos of tzarech eichel nefesh. According to this way of understanding the opinion of Beis Hillel, the way we're explaining that Tosfos understands the opinion of Beis Hillel, so the following is the meaning of the words of Beis Hillel, where we said that Beis Hillel hold mitoich shehutra l'tzerech, so hutra nami shalei l'tzerech. This is how we're going to read those words. Mitoich shehutra l'tzerech, since for tzerech eichel nefesh, these malachas were made mutter, and they were made mutter with a heter of the etzem malacha. It's not that hutra, but rather it's hutra entirely once there is the tzerech. So therefore hutra shalei l'tzerech, which means for all the other leit tzerech outside of the tzerech tzas. So mitech shehutra l'tzerech. So even if it's a tzerech tzas, but since the heter is such that it's hutra, not hutcha, so it's hutra also shalei l'tzerech. And this is whether it's miktsas of tzerech eichel nefesh, meaning that a person only needs a little bit of what they prepared. So we say mitech shehutra l'tzerech tzas, hutra for the rest of it, the larger amount that they don't need, or whether it's a tzerech that has a common element, which means a miktsas of the tzerech of eichel nefesh. Mitech shehutra l'tzerech ktsas, meaning it's only a little bit of tzerech eichel nefesh because it's a different tzerech, but it has a common element that it's tzerech adam. So mitech shehutra l'tzerech of ktsas qualitatively hutra nami shalei l'tzerech. And therefore, because of this way of learning the opinion of Beis Hillel, so Tosfos hold in the opinion of Beis Hillel that these malachas were only made mutter when there is a tzerech ktsas, because it's a tam, it's a reason, it's not a siman, it's a reason. So the reason has to be there, and there must be minatera a tzerech ktsas. However, since the way it's mutter is in a way of hutra, so therefore, even when it's only tzerech ktsas, both in quantity or quality, it'll be mutter. Now we're going to come back to the question that we had on the Alter Rebbe and answer it. But before we actually give the answer, we're going to have a lead up into the answer. And in this lead up, we're going to change our understanding of the pasuk in our parsha that we brought up at the beginning of the Sicha that speaks about the Isser of doing malacha on Pesach and the heter of malachas eichel nefesh on Pesach. So according to this understanding of Beis Hillel, and the second way that we said that Tosfos understands Beis Hillel, so we can say that Alter Rebbe holds this way as well, and we'll understand what he writes in the Shulchan Aruch by first explaining the following. So we're going to bring up a question over here and an answer, and that's going to lead up to answering and understanding what the Alter Rebbe writes. The question is, it doesn't seem to be understood. Why did the Torah write in our parsha that kol malacha lo ye'asav, and therefore it needs to then state the heter of doing malachas eichel nefesh? It should have rather written, as it does, like by all other yamim tevim, that malachas kol malachas avoda lo yisasu, And it would be self-understood that malachas eichel nefesh, which are malachas hana, aren't included in this isser. Why say all malachas are usr and then have to bring up the exception of malachas eichel nefesh? Just say malachas aveda are usr, and we know that malachas eichel nefesh, which are malachas hana and not malachas aveda, are mutter. And the explanation is our parsha is the first time the isser of doing malacha on Yom Tov is taught. And therefore the pasuk writes, not kol malachas aveda loisasu, which indicates that malachas eichel nefesh isn't included in the isser. Rather it writes, kol malacha leya asavahem, to teach us that all malachas are asur on Yom Tov. Afterwards the Torah adds, acha shayacha l'chol nefesh hu levadei yasa lechem, which from this it's understood that the Torah was matter these malachas because of the time that they are tzarech eichel nefesh. So that's why the Torah writes over here, kol malacha le'yasavahem, to teach us that all malachas are aser, including malachas eichel nefesh. It's just that hutra from the time of that they their hutra because of the time of tzarech eichel nefesh, and therefore later in Parshas Emer, the Torah is able to write in short, kol malachas aveda lo'isasu, and one will make a mistake to learn, like the Ramban says, that malachas eichel nefesh weren't aser even mi'ikara. Rather, we already know that they are from our parsha, where it's the first time that it's taught. Later on, the Torah just writes it in short, kol malachas aveda lo'isasu. It's only malachas aveda, not malachas hana. But why only malachas aveda, not malachas hana? That's taught in our parsha, and the first time. And it's because of the time that they're tzarech eichel nefesh, not because they're not included. Kol malacha le'yasavahem, they are included. But if it's tzarech eichel nefesh, then because of that time, because of that reason, they are hutra. They are made to be mutter. According to this, we can now answer the question on the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch teaches the Isser of doing malacha by all Yamim Tevim. He's not just talking about Pesach, he's talking about all Yamim Tevim. And therefore he quotes what's taught by all the Yamim Tevim. That v'chola isa malachas aveda hareza loike shenemar kol malachas aveda loisasu. By all the Yamim Tevim, we have the pasuk of kol malachas aveda loisasu, not the pasuk in our parsha. That's only for Pesach. Since the Alter Rebbe is talking about all Yamim Tevim, so he brings the pasuk that's written by all the Yamim Tevim, kol malachas aveda loisasu. And then he continues and explains, umau malachas aveda. It's called malacha she'ena nasis ba'echel oimashka v'chulu. It's only malachas that are not done with food. Meaning that this pasuk, what he's saying over here is this pasuk is only teaching about malachas aveda, and it doesn't teach what's the din by and regarding malachas eichel nefesh. This pasuk doesn't talk about malachas eichel nefesh. This pasuk only talks about malachas aveda. When we want to know what is the din by malachas eichel nefesh, for that we have to come to the pasuk by Pesach, which is megala what the halacha is, like we said, by all the other Yamim Tevim as well. So in the first part, the Alter Rebbe is bringing the pasuk that's written by all the Yamim Tevim that does not talk about melechas eichel nefesh. It only talks about melechas aveda. And so he says, for melechas aveda, a person gets malchus. And what's melechas aveda? Only if it's not done with eichel or mashke. Afterwards, the Alter Rebbe continues to explain the din of melechas eichel nefesh and its makar as well. And he says that avokol malacha anasis ba'eichel, so those malachas nikroim malachas eichel nefesh. And he's telling us here what the din is and the source. Shatera hitira la'aseisa. The Torah was matter these malachas. Shenemar achashayachol l'chol nefesh hu levada yesalachem. So by the Torah saying ach, it implies that it's being removed from the isser and being made mutter. And so that's how we understand what the Alter Rebbe is teaching us. In the second part, the Alter Rebbe tells us the din of melechas eichel nefesh and its makar. The din is that it's hutra, and we learn it from the pasuk in our parsha where it says that all malachas are aser, and then it says ach, which implies that it's being taken out of the isser and being made mutter, that it's hutra. Not that it's not talking about it at all, it's being made mutter. So from that pasuk, ach hashayachol l'chol nefesh hu levada yesalachem, we see that it's hutra. And that, based on that, we now understand what the Alter Rebbe says. The hira from this in Avodas Hashem is, since the Torah permitted malachas that are aser on Yom Tov, the Torah permitted them for tzerech achilas Yom Tov, so we see how much simchus Yom Tov is an inyan ikri of the moyadim. And as it indeed says in the pasuk, Moyadim l'simcha. So we see that Simchas Yom Tov is an Inyan Ikri of the Moyadim. It says it in the pasuk. We also see it from this idea that the Torah was matter these malachas that are otherwise asur. Why was the Torah matter them? For Tzerech Achilas Yom Tov, for Simchas Yom Tov. Now it's known that the Ha'aras HaMoyadim shines every day, not just on the Yom Tov itself. And according to the above, that Simcha is an Inyan Ikri of Yom Tov, so it's understood that a person must also feel Simchas Yom Tov the whole year. So that's the Hira. Person has to bring Simchas Yom Tov into the whole year. This means, in addition to the Simcha of a person, while doing a mitzvah, the Simcha Shal Mitzvah, which is when a person is actually doing the mitzvah, the Arsa Meidim makes that a person should feel this Simcha, not just when they're doing the mitzvah, but rather the whole day. And so that is the Hira, that a person should bring Simcha into the whole year and into every day and to every moment of each day.